The other thing is the two buildings that our programs are in are not designed for kids to be indoors all the time. We don't have any large motor space. And so, you do want those kids out. You want them getting their moderate to vigorous physical activity, not to mention you just, you don't want to be in one room for the entire day. So if it's really hot or really cold or bad weather days to, air quality, that's going to impact what we're going to do with the kids that time. So you have to kind of adapt, well, what are we going to do internally in the school? Because we know we have hallways, so are we doing obstacle courses? You can adapt, but it's something you have to prepare to do. I also think of transportation of the kids to and from school. We utilize the same buses that the tribal school does. So the tribal school starts their day first and then Head Start will. Well, if there's an adverse weather event, the school will have a delay because of the length of our programming currently. That will stop our programming entirely. The kids will have a snow day or a severe weather day, and they'll have to make that up down the line. New Head Start regulations just went into effect, so now there's going to be a lengthening of the school year and a lengthening of the school day for the Head Start kids. So then it's like, okay, how do you coordinate if someone's going to have an early out day? Now, how do you coordinate the buses because it's a weather event? So, up until yesterday in our conversation, wow, I hadn't, really considered some of those things. So, you don't think weather's really going to affect kids in school so much, but it really does have an impact. I have my home visitors who are on the road, and then there's the safety of my home visitors in the car. If it's, you're having increased severe rains and weather because it's warmer longer, then, your driving conditions are still not so great. Or if we have those in-between days where, you're not having big snow, but you have a little bit of drizzle and freezing temperatures, again, you don't want your home visitors on the road, so then you have to make up those days with the families. So, it's those little things that you don't think about. And it's like, yeah, you put the kids in a building and everything's fine, and they go home and everything's fine. And so it's, it's a little, schools are a little microcosm of, the greater community. So I think expertise on the trending, what the trends are going to look like. And I know, 1 year does not make a trend, but if we can use what looks like it's trending based on the history of what we're seeing right now, I think that will in the future help us plan for, how do we do our emergency preparedness plans to incorporate longer days and some of this, or do we have to look at getting grants to build large motor areas because it just appears that we're going to be spending more time indoors. Also maybe I'm thinking now they're changing up all the windows in the Norbert Hill Center. The ones that are my Three Sisters site, none of the windows open. So if we lost power and it was a hot day, it's going to get very close in there very quickly. Is there some way outside of generators that we can be kind of off of the grid? Do we, put solar panels in there so we store our own battery power? Do we, what are some of the changes that we can make to our structural environment that we can work with what this trend is going to be? I mean, it's going to happen. So how do we be proactive about that? And I think that's where we need that trending data. This is kind of what it's going to look like in the future. So then, when we go seeking monies or grants or whatever to try to adapt to this, we can use that data going, this is what we're seeing, this is why we have to do it. We can't wait until it's here. It's coming, it's starting. That's how I would probably utilize the data.
The important thing to realize about climate change impacts on extreme weather and then the sort of downstream impacts of that weather, and this is true whether you're talking about Wisconsin or more generally, is that the stories, even though climate change is a global impact, the stories are local, right? And so we see pretty different things taking place, for example, in the Milwaukee area than are taking place in the Driftless region in the western part of the state. And stories that are even going in opposite directions. So in the Driftless region, we've actually seen declining severity of floods in recent years, and that's basically because in that part of the state, floods are driven primarily by snow melt in the early spring or rainfall falling on snow, and as the climate warms, the snow's on the ground for less time, and so you have and we're potentially having less snowfall overall in some cases as well, and so the conditions for severe flooding are going down. Now, in the Milwaukee area, a big urban area, the situation is very different. So in that case, you have sort of combined impacts of climate change, increasing extreme rainfall, with urbanization, basically paving over previously natural surfaces, and so you have less water infiltrating and more of it running off. And so that all combines to exacerbate flooding. And there we're actually seeing floods shifting from primarily being in the springtime to being in the summer. Basically, you have these big summertime thunderstorm systems, bigger than they used to be, and basically having really big impacts on the built-up part of the city. You really don't hear the term rural green infrastructure. It's always this urban issue. And so are there ways to think about how to help Wisconsin's smaller communities deal with some of these issues that they're facing? Of course, those communities have fewer resources available than a large city like Milwaukee, and so it presents unique challenges as well as opportunities.
Right.
One of the things with infrastructure is that it takes a long time for changes in policies to actually become changes on the ground, because it's not all built overnight, and also floods don't happen every other day, and so it can take potentially decades to know whether the investments that you've made are actually paying off, right? Because you may have to wait quite some time for a major flood to occur. Now, on the other hand, when that flood does occur, we know from a lot of study over the years that there are really tremendous cost savings associated with these sorts of infrastructure measures. So we see benefit cost ratios of 5 to 1 typically when it comes to flood mitigation infrastructure, and that's beating the stock market and anything else you'll find out there. So it's just that the payoffs you have to wait quite a while to see them.
Okay.
So the trends vary depending on where you are in the state, and depending on whether you're talking about urban areas versus rural areas, large river systems versus very small watersheds. The stories can be quite different. And so, one thing that's been consistent is that our winters are shorter, and so the snow is staying on the ground for less time in the spring. And so those areas where historically floods have occurred in the springtime, those floods are actually dropping in magnitude typically. And then in those areas that are sensitive to summertime storms, these short-lived but really intense thunderstorms, those areas are seeing increases in flood risk, and those are typically the urban areas.
There have been a few communities that have
the road out. And, you know, if you have your clinic on that road or your patients on that road, then you cannot get to them, you cannot access them. And, you know, hopefully flooding is something that, you know, is very rare. You know, it just doesn't seem that that is necessarily in the cards, that, you know, we'll see more flooding, more weather-related events that have a kind of large impact on the community.
We know that in many of our cities and communities, our water infrastructure is failing. The pipes are rusting. And if you have heavier precipitation and runoff, that's more of a risk for water contaminations.